Rico Donnie here at the new Top Velocity Baseball Science Series, where we go out and do the hard work for you to bring you the latest in high velocity pitching science. So great episode for you on the effects of upper trunk rotation on shoulder joint torques among baseball pitchers of various levels. It's an exciting study because it takes professional, college, high school, youth pitchers and shows the differences in stress or in torques that they're putting on their arms. And you'll actually find that what you think is happening is not happening. Now we have two charts here of data. This chart showed torques, overall torques on all those levels. This was torques based on their body weight. So when you took their body weight and the torques they were putting on themselves based on their body weight, gave us some different way of looking at the stress they were putting on their arm. And what this study discovered is revolutionary, and it really goes against the conventional wisdom of pitching and how to train pitchers for performance. Why don't you tell them the method? What did they do first to get this information and this data we see on the board?
Sure. So they took 38 pitchers, pro, college, high school, youth level pitchers. They put biomarker suits on them, so essentially motion capture systems. It's kind of same stuff that they use like in video games to capture motion, stuff like that. So they did 15 pitches at 60 feet 6 inches, and they really just wanted to measure the torque put on the arm compared to the mechanics.
All right, so now that we know how they got this information, let's look at it. Now, pro, college, high school, youth, we see the youth pitchers' overall torques was the least. Makes sense, right? They're not throwing the hardest. At the same time, too, they are smaller. They're smaller than the other ones here. When we went up to high school, of course, the speeds went up and the torques went up. We went to college, the speeds went up and the torques went up. But very interesting, when we went to the professional level and the speeds went up or stayed the same, torques went down. The stress on the arm went down. Unbelievable. Now, if we add the body weight to it, it got even more interesting. The professional pitchers had the least amount of torques put on the body, even to the youth pitchers. High school had the highest amount of torques put on the body. It's very interesting. Many different ways to looking at this, but I think it follows along the lines of the old Kibler and Chandler study that I've talked about in previous episodes, that when you decrease the energy coming up the body, the energy delivered from the hip and trunk to the arm, when you decreased it by 20%, you had to overcompensate by 34% on the internal rotation speeds to keep the same force on the hand. So when there's a reduction of momentum, when there's a reduction of trunk energy, lower half energy, there's an overcompensation of arm energy. And we see the professional pitchers are the best at preventing that overcompensation. Now, what did this study determine what was causing the reduced torques at the professional level? And it was the timing of movement, specifically the timing of movement, and then they cited the speed principle. What is the speed principle? The speed principle says in the structure of the body, there's proximal and distal movements in the body. Proximal are closer to the core of the body. Distal movements are farther away. So the arm movements are going to be more the distal movements. The proximal movements are going to be more the hips and trunk movements. In the speed principle, perfect timing is not starting the distal movements until the proximal movements have maximized velocity. So once the proximal movements, the hips and trunks, have maximized speeds, the moment it maximizes, that's when you should initiate the distal movements. If there's an early release of the distal movements, then that's a disruption in the timing, inefficiency in the timing, and then the torques go up. So to reduce the torques in the arm, you have to learn to better time your proximal to distal movements. Specifically in this study, they found that the high velocity pitchers or the professional pitchers rotated their trunks later than all the other pitchers. 34% into the movement of the delivery, they rotated their trunks. All the other pitchers on average about 14% into the movement. They had already rotated their trunks. Also, what we know is hip to shoulder separation. The professional pitchers created more hip to shoulder separation, which they believe gave the arm more time to load properly, gave those distal movements the better timing to initiate following the maximum speeds of the proximal movements. So that's how we do this. We want to become professional pitchers. It's not how much torque and how much stress we can put on our arm. It's how well we can time and how late we can release the trunk. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about some popular training methods. Steven, give us some popular training methods today that we know about.
Weighted balls, extreme long toss, arm strength training.
Okay, so weighted balls, extreme long toss, arm strength training, things like what? Tubing, rice buckets, over strengthening the arms to handle the stress, right? Okay. Let's talk about how long have these been around? How long do you think these have been around? We know specifically weighted balls. Talk about the study. We have a study, one of the oldest studies we could find on weighted balls. Talk about that.
Yeah, so Brose and Hansen had a study called The Effects of Overload Training on Velocity and Accuracy of Throwing from 1967.
So we have a study, which means that before that, weighted balls had been around for a while, that actually had studied the effects of overload on underload training. So they have been using this approach of strengthening the arm to increase performance since, more than likely, documented in 1967. Extreme long toss more than likely has been around as long. Now, the only study we have of extreme long toss is recent, but we know this approach has been around for a while. And same thing of strengthening the arm. When strengthening became big into baseball, arm strengthening for pitchers was the first most popular way of doing it. But how effective are these approaches in getting the results? What do we know about weighted balls for increasing speeds for pitchers? Is it effective?
Yeah, studies show that it can increase ball velocity on average 2 to 3 miles per hour.
So there is studies that weighted balls do work. There's no studies that extreme long toss increases speed. These are just studies. And arm strengthening, yes, there's studies that showed strengthening the shoulder, strengthening the arm increased velocity, not significantly. But is this effective? Is this effective? If we look at the science of today and what we know, is it effective? I would argue not. I would argue it's very insignificant to what a professional pitcher is really doing. Is the professional pitcher handling more torques? Are they surviving more stress in the arm than the college, high school, and youth pitcher? No, based on these studies, based on the Kibler and Chandler study, no. They're doing a better job of generating momentum in their body, timing their movements, and getting that energy from the proximal movements to the distal movements. And your training protocol should be strictly built on that method, using the entire kinetic chain, developing the leg strength, the leg power, training the leg drive movements, developing the core strength, the core power, training the trunk movements of professional pitchers, then getting into the arm path at that point, working it up the chain as opposed to down the chain. Warning, caution, if you're in a training program in the off season that uses high amounts of arm care because your arm is overworked and too sore, then that is a flawed approach because it's using an approach that is not backed by science, unfortunately. That's why we highly recommend, obviously we're biased to it, the 3X and 2X velocity programs for pitchers and position players, because we follow the science and we take the full kinetic chain and we develop its timing efficiencies, its momentum and power, moving energy from the proximal to distal movements to increase performance and reduce injuries. So we'll see you on the next episode of the Top Velocity Baseball Science Series.